And welcome one, welcome all to season 4. Yes, season 4 of We Are Being Transformed. Here we explore liminal spaces and the contours of reality, the myriad of ways people interact with the world through the vehicles of ritual, cult, and lore. And our guest this morning, returning to the show, you all know him. I consider him a cornerstone of this project. His help has been immeasurably important to the show and the standards that we set here. Of course, I'm talking about Professor Edward J. Watts. Dr. Watts is professor of history at the University of California in San Diego. He's the author of numerous seminal books and articles on Roman history, including The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, City and School in Late Antiquity, and the topic of our discussion this afternoon. And it is a riot, and that's a little bit on the nose, but you'll see why this is going to be wild in a second. Topic of our discussion this afternoon, it's a microhistory. It's called Riot in Alexandria, Tradition and Group Dynamics in Late Antique Pagan and Christian Communities. So without further ado, Professor Watts, welcome back to the show. It's always an honor to have you visit.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be back and to talk about Riot in Alexandria.
Absolutely. It's been too long. And so just to set the scene, one nondescript Friday, kind of probably like any other Friday in the late 5th century, 485 Common Era, to be exact, an incident occurred that, from an outsider's perspective, looked like a common squabble between students. So a group of students is disciplining what is, for all intents and purposes, a mouthy peer and defending the honor of their teacher. Can you briefly summarize this incident, and why is it a lot more than meets the eye?
Yeah, I think to summarize this incident, it's important to start in the physical context that we're operating in. So we're in the city of Alexandria. It's a city of a few 100,000 people, maybe as many as 500,000 people, and we're in the year 485. And this is a moment in the Roman Empire where, we're about 100 years, 150 years into a process where the Roman government has been pouring a significant amount of money into building educational centers and particularly university districts in major cities. And so our riot is taking place in what I think, for lack of a better term, and to not be terribly anachronistic, is the University of Alexandria. So it's a collection of at least 20 or so classrooms. It's now been excavated. It's just outside of the main train station in the city of Alexandria. And this is a classroom complex that is staffed by teachers and professors who are funded by the imperial government. And so these are publicly funded teachers teaching public education to students, and they're teaching the full curriculum. So it seems that we have teachers there teaching grammar, which is what is the kind of first wave of education beyond basic letters and reading. There are teachers who are educating their students in rhetoric. There are teachers of philosophy. There are teachers of medicine. There are teachers of law. It is like a full service university. And the student that we're looking at is a young student. He's a teenager. He's a student of one of the professors at this university who doubles up as a teacher of philosophy as well. And he was raised as a pagan and was, in a sense, selected the University of Alexandria because his brother was also a teacher and had an association and had a relationship with a couple of the teachers active in that university. And so our student named Apuleius is sent as a good pagan to be educated in a safe environment. In the 480s, the empire is now majority Christian and has been probably for nearly 100 years. And so it's a minority. It's a student who belongs to a religious minority being educated by somebody who is supposed to look out for his interests and allow him to practice his religion and follow the inclinations of his identity to the degree that he feels comfortable. What ends up happening, though, is he falls in with a group of peers who are not only Christian, but kind of militantly Christian. So they are associates of a monastery that is located just outside of Alexandria. For those of you who are anti-Chalcedonian super fans, it's the monastery of the Henaton, where Severus of Alexandria will eventually, go into exile. And so it's a monastery that it's not a mild place to be, right? It is a center of resistance to the Council of Chalcedon, and it has a student outreach organization that these other students belong to. Paralyus gets wrapped up in this student outreach organization, and he begins shooting off his mouth about the religious convictions and behaviors of his teachers. And so this is what sparks the violence in the hallway outside of one of the classrooms that you can now visit in Comaldika. You can now go and actually walk, probably, I think, basically to the place where the violence starts. Yeah. So.
I was
think,
waiting for you. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no. So the violence unfolds initially in a relatively confined space and in a relatively confined moment. It is very, very normal in an educational setting for there to be a hierarchy of students and for students to discipline each other in a kind of a way that we might equate to hazing, but it's a policing of the standards of your community. And so when you study under a teacher in late antiquity, or even in the earlier classical period, you associate with that teacher on a very intimate level. And so there are Platonic dialogues that talk about you're enrolling under a teacher of philosophy as a sort of transformation from your biological family to your intellectual family. And students talk about their professors as fathers or mothers. They talk about their fellow students as brothers. It isn't just rhetoric that you are supplementing or exchanging your biological family for an intellectual family. It's actually a lived experience. And there are all sorts of rituals that encourage students to believe this, from integration rituals, where in Athens, you are brought into a bath and you go through a process that is not that dissimilar from what we see in a mystery cult. You're blinded, all sorts of nonsense words are spoken. You're threatened, you're supposed to be made scared. You actually even have a ritual cleansing, kind of like a baptism. And so there's all sorts of liminal sort of spaces you traverse from your introduction to the community to your sort of establishment as an initiate. But every time you traverse these steps, you're supposed to have a loyalty to the community you belong to and a loyalty to the person in charge of it. And so when Paralyus starts mouthing off about, my teacher and his associates are charlatans, they don't actually, they say that they've performed miraculous deeds in association with the pagan gods. It's all made up. This is something that requires disciplining. The problem that happens after Paralyus is disciplined is, in a sense, Paralyus has a posse, right? He has the Philoponoi associated with Henaton, who are supposed to be infiltrating, converting, whatever word you want to use, whatever verb you want to use for what they're doing in the schools. They like conflict. And so when somebody who is loyal to them and is criticizing pagan teachers gets beat up, they have cause to now bring in their associates and have them make some trouble in the schools. And so this is how what would be a small event within an academic community, and not rare, I mean, this kind of stuff happened all the time, it suddenly becomes something much bigger, because the student associates go to the Henaton monastery. The Henaton monastery goes to the Bishop of Alexandria. The Bishop of Alexandria thinks it's a great moment to gin up some conflict with pagans. Paralyus knows of a kind of pagan house church, for lack of a better term, where rituals had been conducted. And so he turns the monks of Henaton, backed by the Bishop of Alexandria, loose on this shrine. They find evidence of an Isis cult that's like hidden behind a fake wall. They then trot out all of the objects. They have a procession. And then there is an investigation that's launched that ultimately leads to sanctions against the pagan community. A number of people are forced into exile. One person actually dies under questioning. And whoever is left in Alexandria is still a public educator. And so they have to make compromises about what they teach. And so something that starts out very small ends up really significantly reshaping the way Alexandria works. But what's also interesting is in each of these communities, the students in these pagan educational centers in Alexandria, the community of monks in Hanaton and the students associated with them, and then even the materials that circulate related to the church in Alexandria, all of them have a narrative that they sort of play out when these conflicts unfold. And then the conflict as it emerges and as it ends gets reintegrated into the narrative to change the way that they think about their interactions with each other. And so it's a moment where the past shapes the present and the present shapes the future, and everything is kind of in dialogue with itself. And so it's a very interesting micro-historical moment, but I think it's also a very interesting human moment, right? This is just a teenager who is like weird and doesn't have a lot of friends and like doesn't have great social skills, and all of those things manifest and somehow it explodes across an entire city.
Yeah, he's very much like he very much like throws a fit. He's like, well, that priestess of Isis is icky and smelly, and I forget the teacher's name, but he really didn't get divine intervention for the pregnancy of his wife and all this stuff. And they basically just show him like who's who in the pecking order, and the Philoponoi, like you were saying, who kind of reminded me of almost like when I was in college. There was this the type of students who would like take there was like a shared common space that everybody would kind of like commune around, like outside, and they would like have the megaphones, and they would start like arguing with people and doing apologetics for Christ or whatever. That's kind of what they reminded me of. They're always looking for like some kind of affront that they can use to shape their narrative of being persecuted. But this is extremely important. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you imagine like a character in Mean Girls or Heathers, right? I mean, this is kind of who he is, right? Being sort of thrown into an environment where like his only friends are those megaphone people standing on the quad, and that's kind of what you get, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that if anybody's interested in learning more about these insane ancient pedagogical kind of initiation rituals, Professor Watts and I's first discussion on city and school in late antiquity, we focus more on the Athenian side of things, but it's pretty much the same kind of concept. Like go look at that video. It's a criminally underrated video, and what I like to emphasize here is the importance of pedagogy in antiquity, because I was talking to a scholar named Kenneth Elliott about declamations, and he really made the point that if you really want to understand a culture, we should probably understand mostly what they're teaching their children. So I think this is an extremely important topic. So, but getting back on this, whether it be the students, the monks, the bishop, the common denominator for all of these parties is a shared communal memory. I'd like to tackle each of these separately. Then we'll kind of tie them back together when we get to the outcome of the riot itself. So I want to start with the philosophical schools. Tell us about the role of tradition and shared memory in the philosophical schools.
I mean, it couldn't be any stronger. So I think that if you go back even to pre-Socratic philosophers like the Pythagoreans, there's a very, very strong sense that your philosophy is something that you live. And the only way that you can understand the true implications of that philosophy is to look at how people in your community who are exemplars lived exemplary lives according to whatever philosophical principles they've been taught. And so this is like deeply, deeply ingrained in ancient philosophy. When you are a philosopher, you are not just thinking esoteric thoughts, you're learning a lifestyle. and you have to embody that lifestyle in everything that you do. And the people who come before you in that community show you how to do that. And so we tend to interact with ancient philosophy by looking, at the deep philosophical texts. But for an ancient philosophy student, they would look at those texts, but when they were taught those texts, the text would intersect with examples of people in their community that illustrated what this thing actually means in practice. So we have a lot of documents that come out of late antique philosophical tradition that reflect, the teaching methods that go all the way back to like Middle Platonism. But within these texts, we see that you will in your study, you'll read something from a philosophical source text, a Platonic dialogue, or maybe an Aristotelian text. And when you do that, then you will discuss it in class, and the things that you discuss are going to, look at how other scholars in the past have interpreted this text, but also how people in your community embodied the truth that that text expresses. So the philosophical commentary tradition has a lot of, okay, here's a quote from Plato. Here's what one commentator said. Here's what another commentator said. And oh, by the way, my teacher, gave me this anecdote about how he did something that is in accordance with this text. And so you see both, the Platonic text in its interpretation, but also in its implementation. And so every philosophical community was grounded in bringing the philosophy from the abstract into the tangible. And the people who belonged to that philosophical community showed how that grounding took place by living their lives according to those philosophical principles. And the stories that illustrated how one did that are a key part of making that philosophy that seems so abstract a practical reality. And so it's like deeply, deeply integrated in what it means to be a philosopher. The other aspect of that that's really important is this is a hierarchical community. And so your teacher is your philosophical father. And so when you hear something directly from your teacher, it has a great deal of authority. And so if your teacher said, I saw this exemplary figure do X, Y, or Z, that means a lot more to you than just, some random person telling you that this philosopher did X, Y, or Z, because there's an emotional connection with the source who shared that information with you. And so these stories, this sort of shared history of what philosophy means, are actually extremely powerful because of the way the education worked, but they're even more powerful when they're transmitted person to person in a setting that emphasizes the connection you have with the source, that is telling you that particular narrative.
Absolutely. And I think the examples I went back to and that you use heavily in the book, I went back to, for instance, Eunapius's Lives of the Sophists and the Philosophers. I also went back to the life of Proclus. I went back to the life of Plotinus. And you're right. It's the same kind of concept. You look in Eunapius, and he's telling you the same thing that you're emphasizing. He's saying, I heard this from this chain of succession. There's a chain of succession. And like you said, these people are so close, and they're going on walks and having deep discussions with these teachers all the time. And they're hearing from the students of these former great men. And they're like saying, I heard it directly from this person in the chain of succession. And he even mentions, I heard other things as well, but I won't put them here because, it doesn't mean as much as this, because this is coming from this person who's important in the chain, so to speak. And it's the same kind of thing, like the exemplary figure of the teacher, the philosopher teacher, in these late antique pagan sources is extremely important for the collective memory of not only where things have been, but where your school is at the moment, because you see yourselves in that kind of chain.
Yeah, no, it isn't just like, hey, let's learn about the past of our community. It's about how should I respond when I see a similar situation in my life. And so these things are really, really instructive because they are the things that allow you to understand how you take what can seem abstract and apply it to a reality that you might not have anticipated. And I also emphasize that, it might seem strange that pagan philosophers are doing this, but it's not at all weird in antiquity for people to really, really focus on materials that come out of the mouth of somebody who is important and authoritative. I mean, this is, in a sense, the like working model of the Gospel of Matthew, where he's really emphasizing Jesus said this, Jesus said this, Jesus said this. Like, let's focus on what Jesus said, because the source matters. And if you're getting something from Jesus, that is more important even than if you get it from like Paul, right? And so the stronger and more authoritative the source, the stronger and more authoritative the idea. And also, of course, the better you can model your behavior on the example that authoritative source is providing to you. So I think that it's sometimes easy for us to look at these pagan philosophical communities and say, yeah, I took philosophy in college, and like, I don't care at all what my professor said about what his professor did when such and such thing happened to them, right? It's like, here's a weird, person who I'm taking a course from, and I'm not particularly attached to them emotionally. That's not how it was in antiquity. If you're taking a course from a philosopher and you really belong to that philosophical community, you're all in, right? And you're defending that person's honor because that person is your connection to what's true, and your connection, who's going to help you understand how the ideas that are presented by somebody like Plato actually apply to your life 800 years later.
And this is also tied inextricably tied to how these schools were. The schools really did kind of live or die on the reputation and on the kind of traditions around the teacher himself. And this kind of goes back to what Apuleius is saying about his teachers. You're not just messing with the tradition, you're messing with the kind of the centerpiece of our tradition. And, it's also takes on an economic kind of aspect of causing problems, because like, if you say something bad about this person and he gets around, then that's going to affect his livelihood and hence our schools. So yeah, it just goes back to how these schools were. Did I cut out there? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. No, I think with Apuleius, the interesting thing about it is he is an initiate, right? He's an insider. And so these student philoponoids associated with Hanaton, they're outsiders. I mean, they're taking the classes, but they're taking the classes. They're not invited to the dinner parties. They're not invited to, the religious festivals. They just are in the classroom. Apuleius is an insider. He's part of the community in the like deepest way. And so when he betrays that community in the eyes of, his fellow students and his teachers, that's much more significant than, a group of Christian troublemakers who never were part of it really anyway. They just paid their tuition and showed up, and like, that was that. For Apuleius, when he comes out and he talks about these people are frauds, well, he knows what he's talking about, right? He's been there. He's been in the room when they've been doing things. He's heard from their mouths claims that their children are divinely conceived. And when he comes out and says, no, it's all made up, that's a real problem, because he would know in a way that some of the other critics of the school would not.
Absolutely. And of course, this role of tradition and shared memory is not just part of the philosophical schools. It's also extremely important to the monastic communities. So I didn't know if you could go into this a bit.
Yeah, so monastic communities actually arise on a kind of model that's not dissimilar from a philosophical community. And if you look at the way like Antony is described by Athanasius, he's described as a philosopher. When Theodoret is describing Syrian monks in the religious history, he's describing them as philosophy or as philosophers. And the asceticism that they practice is actually called philosophy by these authors. And so when you set up a community like a monastic community, it's natural that you would look to a model that's similar to a philosophical community, because ultimately that's what you're doing, at least in the minds of some of the most articulate commentators and catalogers of monastic life. So because this is a philosophy, you have a philosophical mentor who designs the patterns of life in the community in a way that structures the actual things you do in a fashion that's consistent with the ideal behaviors that this monastic leader thinks is consistent with how Christianity can be most purely practiced. And so this looks like a philosophical community because to many people, it is a philosophical community. And so your philosophical master in a monastery has the same sort of power that a philosophical master in a pagan philosophical school has. You hang on every word that they can provide to you about how to embody, in a practical sense, the philosophy that they are teaching and talking about in liturgy or in assemblies or in meetings where you're discussing scripture. This is also a community that is like devoted to understanding on a deeper level how religious practice and truth can be manifested in a practical way and guiding your life in this world around these notions of truth that are articulated by a particular master who founded or superintends the community that you belong to. And so it is totally natural that the same kind of dynamic would be in a monastery as in a philosophical school, because the patterning is, in many ways, it's exactly the same.
Absolutely, and we see the Philoponoi kind of playing upon this later when they bring Paraelius to them to state their case about how he's being religiously persecuted. But that's not where shared memory stops either, because also in this story is the bishop. Shared memory and tradition is extremely important, of course, to the church hierarchy in Alexandria. So I didn't know if you could talk about the communal memory and tradition and how that shapes Peter Mongus's reaction. I hope I'm saying that right, Peter Mongus.
Yeah.
Reaction to and manipulation of the facts of Paraelius's beating.
So the church in Alexandria has a particularly distinguished history of resisting on theological grounds, and they would say on sort of grounds of Christian religious purity, the pressures that are put in place by especially the Roman government. This, of course, starts before the Great Persecution, but it becomes really, really pronounced in the 4th century when Athanasius, who's the Nicene bishop of Alexandria from the 320s until 373, he's exiled a number of times. I think it's 5 times because of his resistance to emperors who are putting pressure on him to do things that he doesn't think are the right things to do. And this establishes a model for Alexandrian bishops that is really geared towards purity of religious ideology and resistance whenever that purity is challenged. And so from Athanasius to Theophilus to Cyril to Dioscorus, you just have bishop after bishop after bishop who becomes an exemplary figure pushing back against pressures that they see to be unjustly restricting the actual genuine practical applications of Christian teaching. And the Alexandrian church is really, really good at creating mechanisms to reinforce the idea that this is how a bishop should behave. So there are, liturgical commemorations of these figures. There are multiple days a year where you celebrate Cyril or Athanasius or even Dioscorus. There are multiple occasions where you can go to a site that they have purified. So one of the most prominent sites in the city of Alexandria was the site of the old Serapeum temple, and this was destroyed in 392. And then you had a martyrion of Cyrus and John that's erected there as a way to kind of demonstrate the Christianization of this sacred site, but also demonstrate, the victory of Christianity, and go and commemorate the bishop who had created this and had brought about the purification of the site and then the construction and Christianization of this location. And so the Alexandrian church has this history of resisting pressure in the name of kind of pure understanding of what Christian belief should be. And it is something where it's very, very difficult to go against that trend because it's commemorated over and over and over again in the city of Alexandria. And so Alexandrian Christians know this is what their bishop is supposed to do, right? The bishop is supposed to resist, resist, resist. And in the middle part of the 5th century, the thing you're supposed to resist is the Council of Chalcedon. So this becomes a real problem because the Council of Chalcedon happened in 451, and it was a response to a previous council of Ephesus that had been run by the Alexandrian bishop Dioscorus in a particularly brutal way. And so Dioscorus was reprimanded at Chalcedon. He's removed from office. He's put into exile. And then the findings of Chalcedon are, well, the Roman government attempts to impose them on Egypt. And you run into this sort of tendency of resistance. And it creates real problems where the church in Egypt and the church in Constantinople do not agree for basically a generation. And there's real tension in Egypt and there's violence. And so when we're talking about Peter Mongus in the 480s decides enough is enough, right? We have to make some kind of an agreement. And he makes an agreement. He signs on to something called the Henoticon that he negotiated with the Emperor Zeno and the Bishop of Constantinople. And the Henoticon is effectively a don't ask, don't tell about Chalcedon, right? It's like, yeah, okay, we're probably not going to solve this, so let's not talk about it, and we'll all come back into communion with each other. Practically, it's a good outcome. But in terms of how Alexandrian bishops are supposed to behave, it's a very bad outcome, because this is not what Alexandrian bishops are supposed to do. They're not supposed to compromise. They're supposed to resist, resist, resist. And Peter Mongus is stuck because he's not resisting. And so that causes real problems for him, because he came into office as somebody who was on the resistance side of things. And all of a sudden he's compromised, and that has compromised his position.
Yeah, he's losing support from the hardline anti-Chalcedonian people who happen to be this monastic kind of milieu. So he's like, oh, this is a perfect opportunity for me to kind of show off my power and that I'm on their side, and maybe bring that group kind of more on my side. So he takes, like what we said at the beginning, is for all intents and purposes just some students hazing a mouthy peer for kind of not knowing his place in the hierarchy, to this is a religious persecution. And what are we going to do about it? And what happens in the collective memory? Well, Ed, because we talked about what happened to Hypatia a few generations or so before this. So this ultimately spills over into violence.
Yeah. And I think this is the thing that Peter Mongus faces. So there is this resistance discourse, right, where Alexandrian bishops are supposed to resist, resist, resist. You're not supposed to compromise with authorities when they're doing something that doesn't seem Christologically correct. Peter Mongus, he breaks with that, right? He does compromise with the Emperor Zeno. But there's another model, and this is a model that really the Bishop Theophilus, and to a lesser degree Cyril, pioneered in the 5th century, late 4th and early 5th centuries. And that's an anti-pagan model, right? If you aren't going to resist, one thing you can do is cooperate with imperial authorities and use that cooperation to strike against pagans. And so this is another way you mobilize the enthusiasm of a Christian community in Alexandria. If you're not going to resist imperial power, you cooperate with them to do something that enhances the prestige of Christianity by knocking down the prestige of paganism. In the 390s and in the 410s, there's still a significant pagan community that is very publicly present in the city of Alexandria. So there's stuff to push back against. And that's, what Theophilus does when he tears down the Serapeum. It's what Cyril does when he sponsors things like reconstructions of churches on sites of old pagan temples. There isn't much of a pagan community in public in the city of Alexandria. There are people, but there's not many structures you can go against. And so Peter Mongus, it's not easy to go after pagans in the way that sort of Theophilus could have 100 years before. But when the people from Hanaton come, And the people from Anatan are very militantly anti-Chalcedonian. So, this is like the core of Peter Mongus's problem is, these are the people who really, really believe he sold out. When they come to him and say, hey, we know of a pagan shrine, yeah, it's not so big, but we know of it. There's actual activity taking place there. For Peter Mongus, this represents a kind of way to shift focus. So now he's not the sort of Weasley guy who compromised with imperial authorities and sold out anti-Chalcedonianism. Now he's the guy who attacked pagans. And so he signs off on this. The monks go with Paralyus. They go to this house shrine. They find some pagan stuff in the house shrine. And then Peter Mongus superintends a procession to bring it into the city of Alexandria and change the narrative about who he is. And so now he's not Athanasius, because he can't be, because he compromised, but he can be Theophilus. He can be the warrior against paganism. And so he stages this public display that evokes Theophilus. Even though, when you take down the Serapeum, you're taking down the second biggest temple in the entire Mediterranean. There's a lot of stuff that you get when you take that down. When you take down like a house temple of Isis out in a suburb, you're not getting very much. It's not a very impressive haul, but it's enough, right? It's enough that you can stage a spectacle. And this sort of changes the way people talk about Peter Mongus. And this is why he does it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Peter Mongus is not the only person who does this. Like you were mentioning, the succession of bishops in Alexandria do this, but you also find this in Shenute the Great as well. Like he rails against paganism this way too. Of course, the reality is probably a lot different, but he talks about like going in and destroying the secret pagan shrines and creating this rhetorical narrative of the warrior, the Christian warrior, kind of triumphing against paganism. So Peter Mongus is kind of in that kind of company. And just before we move on to my next question, people are probably wondering, well, why does it matter what they say about the substance of Christ or whatever, or if everybody agrees? Because obviously it's not working on the ground. But I'm reading this book right now called Religious Dissidents in the late Antiquity by I believe her last name is Colos, Magistina Colos, and she talks about how this wasn't just a matter of like right belief. This is literally everybody has to believe and be on the same page, because the health and the well-being of the empire itself depends on it. So these people took this stuff very seriously, and the fact that there was this dissent in Alexandria and lots of Egypt at this time is extremely exasperating, and people are looking for extremely desperate to find ways to answer this problem. So
yeah, I think that's I think that is it, that mentality is very much a part of everything in antiquity, right? This idea that you have to do the right things by the gods for the gods to do the right things by you. I think that it's a challenge to say exactly what's going through the minds of these people in Alexandria. How much of the conflict about Chalcedon they even understand, and how much of their reaction to this is more about this is what we do, right? We resist. You can't tell us, and you can't tell our bishops what to think. You can't impose bishops on us because our community should have the autonomy to do that. That's a huge part of the Christian identity in Alexandria, and I think in some ways this gets into that same tension that you see in philosophical communities between what the abstract idea is and what it actually means in practice. And so I think when you look at like some of the traditions that are expressed and borne out in sermons or in liturgy, they focus less on like, let's explain what it means to have the same thesis. They don't explain really in depth, let's think about what the nature of Christ is and why it's important that we believe this and not that. They instead are going to emphasize why it's important that we should stick to what we are told to believe, because Otherwise, we're being pressed in ways that are unjust, that's inappropriate. And so it's, I think, more a focus on resisting the imposition of things on a community that should have and believes it does have the correct view of how to approach these questions, and less about like, let's deeply consider the questions themselves. The Alexandrian church used to do those things. And Arianism is what resulted from that, right? Like the deep sort of analysis of sort of theological questions in relatively uncontrolled church spaces that led to Arianism. And so that's not really something that bishops of Alexandria would love people to be doing in the 5th century. Bishops of
Right.
Alexandria love people to think about, this is what it means to be part of this community. This is what like this community as a whole should do. And when there are these tensions that arise, this is how we come together as a community to defend who we always have been and the traditions that are embodied in our leaders right now. And so, yeah, I think this is kind of what's challenging about the Alexandrian church, right? If you look at the late 3rd and early 4th century Alexandrian church, there's a lot of like dynamic, like on the ground theological and intellectual experimentation that really isn't going to be tolerated in the 5th century. It didn't go in a good direction. And so they are much more interested in saying, what do we do practically to emphasize correct behaviors, correct actions, and the strength of our collective community and its leadership, and less interested in like, hey, let's think about this, because let's think about this can be dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get to we've been talking a lot about the Christian reaction to this situation, but of course it has huge repercussions for the pagan community at this period of time. So, Professor Watts, what was the immediate response from those implicated on the philosophical side of the issue? What were the consequences that came with their punishment? Because a lot of them were punished or banished or had to make certain compromises.
Yeah, they don't understand why this happened, right? Like what happens to Paralis is in a pagan, in like an educational context, not only a pagan educational context, but an educational context generally, it's not a problem what happened, right? If you go, let's say you're in a monastery and you do what Paralis does, yeah, you're going to get beaten too. It is not out of line to punish somebody for doing something that undercuts the pretty sort of central personal relationships that tie together a community. And so when the house shrine is attacked in Manuthis, it's alarming to pagans. But when Peter Mongus sparks an investigation that brings imperial commissioners into their schools and starts interrogating pagan teachers and starts arresting them and forces them to flee to other cities, this is seen as totally unjust and disproportionate. They don't really see why there was a problem with what happened to Paralis. They don't see why that would necessitate the kinds of actions that take place afterwards. And they certainly don't believe that there's any reason why they should be investigated. Now, the thing that we haven't mentioned so far, but is important to the investigation, is there's a rebellion in 484 against the Emperor Zeno that was sponsored strongly by pagan intellectuals in the Eastern Mediterranean. And there actually was a character who's sent around to drum up support for this in
Yeah, I was going to bring
particularly
that up, but
pagan.
I wanted to wait till after, but let's bring it up now.
Yeah, I mean, in sort of circles in Alexandria. And so when Peter Mongus goes to imperial authorities and says, hey, you need to look at these people, there is a political reason to look at these people. But some of the pagans who are investigated, they had nothing to do with this rebellion. They didn't support it. Some who did support it, they kind of skate by because they make compromises. But for pagans who lived through this looks like they have been persecuted for not really any good reason. And so this reinforces a narrative of resistance that had circulated to a degree in pagan communities, but really hadn't been acknowledged as greatly. By the time you get into like the 480s and especially into the 490s after the investigations, the narratives that pagans tell are about pagan intellectuals being martyred. So Hypatia becomes a very important figure because she was a pagan intellectual who was murdered by Christians for literally no reason, right? She really is a victim of random violence and kind of prejudice, and you could say persecution, except it's not even really organized. And then they point to other pagans in the 450s, into the 470s, who had tried to change the religious dynamics to stop persecution and ended up failing or getting arrested or sent into exile. By the time you get into the early 6th century, the generation of people who were students in Alexandria during the beating of Apuleius are now leaders in the pagan community. And they start promoting an idea of, resistance would be nice, but it's not possible anymore, right? We've lost. And so what we need to do is not resist, because that ship has sailed. It's not possible to resist anymore. What we need to do is just figure out how to live a life that is completely pure to our principles. And when the state gets too bad and too corrupt for us to do it, we need to figure out an exit strategy. And so because of this, the leaders of the pagan intellectual movement are really scarred by what happens in the 480s, and first sort of react like we need to push back, and then kind of do the opposite. They react like we need to pull back and eventually be very aware of when things are so bad that we need to leave. And so in the 530s, one of the pagans who was a student in the 480s actually leads a movement of pagan intellectuals to flee the Roman Empire and go to Persia, because one of them says, we can no longer live under the laws of our community in a Roman space. It's too tyrannical. And that way of understanding Roman politics in the 520s and 530s comes directly from this experience in the 480s, where something that they believe should not have been punished results in this whole cascading set of interventions in their community that they do not believe were justified. And ultimately, it leads to decisions made in the 530s to dissolve that community, leave the Roman Empire. And when they return, they don't return as teachers, they just return as private citizens living, in their own space, doing their own thing. And so the implications are really immense for, not just the 480s, but actually for the entire history of what philosophy is going to be like. Because this ultimately leads to dynamics in the pagan intellectual communities that cause them to dissolve in a fashion that probably wouldn't have happened if this stuff in the 480s hadn't played out in quite this fashion.
Yeah, that's one of my all-time favorite stories about how they felt so persecuted under the under the Roman Empire that they went to Persia. They're like, we're going to leave here. We're noping out. And it seems strange to me, but as I've been doing this project and learning more, those Nestorian Christians had to go somewhere, right? Those expelled heretics had to go somewhere. And where do they go? They go to places like the Persian Empire, things like that. So it's not so far-fetched now, but at the time when I first learned about that, I'm like, that's very funny. It's kind of like somebody telling you, if you don't like living in America, go move to Canada or Europe or something. They actually did it, but then they came back, obviously.
It's like every election where somebody's like, oh my God, if this person leaves, if they win, I'm gonna leave the country and go to wherever. And and you do have it in our country now, right? You do have intellectuals who move to Hungary because they feel more comfortable under Urban. In earlier parts of American history, like in the 50s and 60s, you had people who would leave the country and move to places that were seen as more comfortable for people who were on the left side of the spectrum. And so it happens now. But the way that it happened for these particular philosophers is really remarkable, because it's not only telegraphed, it's also explained. I mean, they actually say in their texts, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. That's really remarkable, because in a lot of antiquity, you see people doing things, but you don't see them articulate exactly why. And you definitely don't see them articulate why in the context of, here is a larger philosophical system. Here's how this particular incident relates to the application of these truths that we've learned in this philosophical system. And so, of course, we're going to take this action because in this context, philosophy as we understand it demands that we do this. It's really rare in antiquity that you have not only an action, but an articulation for why, and a sort of systematic like understanding of how that particular action fits into a sort of larger group process and a larger group pursuit. So this is really one of the very few moments in antiquity where you can actually see this. You know, not only the why, but you can trust that what the person is saying about why was pretty thought out. And they had been thinking about this a long time before they took that action.
Absolutely. Well said. So we've talked about the repercussions on the Hellenic side, the pagan side of things. But in the wake of the riots, a few things happened to change the course of the monastic communities and ecclesiastical leadership in Alexandria as well. So I don't know if you could touch upon that a bit.
Yeah, I think for the monastic communities, what's very interesting is the conflict that the people in Hanatan are having with pagan teachers is both about paganism and pagan kind of behaviors and ideas being promoted in the school, but also they have a very specific concern as well. There's an idea that is quite common in Eastern Christianity as the lead up in the lead up to the year 500 that the world basically will end sometime around the year 500. And there's an idea, I think, that um, Christ was born around 5,500 years after the creation of the world, and so 500 AD will be the end of the sixth day. Therefore, the sort of natural week of time will end, and the world will end, and Christ will come back, and so there is this whole line of thought in Eastern Christianity that, oh my God, the year 500 is going to be it, and like let's get ready for this. And in pagan educational context, they're saying, you know what, like Aristotle shows that that's bullshit, right? Like you can't, the world is not going to end. And so these pagan philosophical teachers are standing up in the classroom and saying like, yeah, I mean, you might be hearing this. It's not right because the world can't end because Aristotle. And after the riot, you get a very aggressive pushback by people associated with the scholastic Philoponoi against this Aristotelian idea. In some cases, they attack the actual pagan teachers who are active in Alexandria. There's a dialogue that's written that attacks the philosopher Ammonius by name, introduces him by name. He's brought out to like speak to his class, and he's refuted by this, like late teens guy who's associated with an Aton monastery, and he's so embarrassed he sends the students away. Never happened, never could have happened. There's no way that the person who wrote this text, who says that he's refuting Ammonius, could have ever refuted Ammonius in like anything. But the attacks get more sophisticated. And by the time you get into like the late 510s and 520s, you have a philosopher named John Philoponus, who his name, I think, gives away his association, who very systematically and pretty convincingly attacks this Aristotelian idea by using pretty well-developed knowledge of Platonic and other sorts of philosophy. And so Philoponus's attacks are really quite significant. But the aggressive move that the student Philoponoi and people associated with Hanatan are making, it's only possible because these professors have kind of been put in their place and discredited. So the public discrediting of these philosophers opens a door for you to do the kind of stuff that Zacharias Scholasticus and Procopius of Gaza, and particularly John Philoponus, are doing. And it makes it much more natural for the Hanatan monks to be looking to bring intellectual ideas into conversation with these pagan intellectuals, because now they are, first of all, weakened, and second of all, like exposed as somewhat fraudulent people. And so that's one of the big implications for the monastic community. It's interesting that for Peter Mongus, this is a blip, right? We know about this from the pagan sources that are affected and changed by what happened in 485. We know about it from sources associated with the student Philoponoi that were made victorious by the events that followed this riot. We don't know about it from Egyptian ecclesiastical sources. This is not what defines the legacy of Peter Mongus for like people in the Egyptian church. It isn't even mentioned. And I think what happens is Peter Mongus uses a shift to attack paganism to like reboot the popular understanding of who he is. But there's not enough paganism to keep attacking. When Theophilus does this, there's lots of pagan stuff to attack, right? It can become a defining feature of his career because he's doing it a lot in very demonstrative and very public ways. For Peter Mongus, like there's not much still to do. And so it happens, and then people are kind of like, yeah, but that's not really who he's about because it doesn't happen anymore. And so I think that also shows something quite interesting. Momentarily, this was a good shift for Peter Mongus, but then it ended. But what we do see is Peter Mongus's position is stabilized after this. And so by just kind of rebooting the conversation, it goes from Peter Mongus is this person who sold out the church and his principles to, wait, okay, Peter Mongus seems like he's an okay guy. And then we just sort of move on because we're not arguing about Chalcedon anymore because we can't, because like, don't ask, they'll tell, Hanaticon, right? And so Peter Mongus, changes the focus enough that he isn't a sellout, but he's also not an anti-pagan champion, but now we just move forward. So I think that there's sort of interesting shifts in the way that each of these communities react. It's particularly, I think, disreputable for Peter Mongus because I think he knew that would happen. I think, this is a PR move for him, and it worked as a PR move, but it wasn't anything substantive because he didn't want it to be anything substantive. But for the other communities, there are really profound shifts in the way those communities function and the role that members of those communities play in the city of Alexandria. And I think that is the long-term legacy that's really important, right? You have a major league kind of historical figure like Peter Mongus, this is not significant. But for these smaller communities that like manage to attract his attention, it dramatically changes the way they interact with each other. And it also dramatically changes the way that they shape their understandings of the world around them. And it leads to really profound implications 40, 50 years down the road that otherwise would not have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen all the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, but I kind of imagine it at this point as like Peter Mongus is like Thanos in Endgame at the end of the movie, and Scarlet Witch is kind of like the Neoplatonic philosophers who are like angry that he did this thing to their tradition, and they're like, you took everything from me. And Peter Mongus, because it was just Tuesday for him, he's like, I don't even know who you are. So I think it's just something like he created as a distraction to kind of get people back on his side and have something for them to rally against. But Ed, this has been, as always, phenomenal. If you have any closing thoughts or things you want to plug, I know you're still working on the book. So feel free to use this time to plug anything you'd like.
Sure. So I guess a couple of things that I would say. The first is this is kind of the opposite of the history that I'm doing right now, which is a history of the Roman state from beginning to end. Microhistory is really important. It's really important if you have a line of sources that you can work on that communicate something that is relatively small about a community that is potentially not all that influential on their own. Those stories are so important because you can get at the human level of why people are doing what they're doing. That's pretty rare in any historical moment, but it's exceptionally rare in antiquity. And I think that there are definitely many more instances like this that scholars and students can find where you can uncover some really fascinating things about the past. And so, less plugging my own work than saying, if you see something like this and you are a student of antiquity, be it in the academy or not, go for it. Because these stories are so important, and they're so rewarding because you can actually get to the sort of essence of why somebody is doing what they're doing. You can kind of see as, in real time as they develop as a person. That is so rewarding, and we need to do more of it because we can do it. And people don't think you can do this in antiquity. The fact that we can do it about people who lived 1,500 or 2,000 or 2,500 years ago absolutely means we should, because it shows so much about the human condition that we didn't think we would ever find. So if you are a student If you are a scholar, if you're a listener, and you find something like this, go for it. It's really, really fun and really, really rewarding.
I'd rather have a great show, honestly, and have scholars enjoy talking to me instead of figuring out an algorithm. I could possibly care less, but I do appreciate that there are people who engage with this stuff. And
Yeah.
we'll be off. We'll be off for a couple of weeks, but then we'll be back with some really hardcore stuff. I'm really excited about Christian Bull. Christian Bull is going to come and talk about his book, the Way of Hermes Trismegistus. Book I've been studying for like a year because I'm not going to go into that without my A game. But thank you all for watching and listening to me ramble. And Ed, thank you once again.
Sure. Thanks a lot.